All right. Welcome, Kevin.
Thanks for having me.
Welcome to the CETL podcast. We are very excited to have you here today. And before we start, asking to you a couple of questions, I just want to share with everybody here a little bit about you. Kevin is an assistant professor here at UNI for history, specifically focusing on public and American history. We are going to keep an eye on a few publications Kevin has coming out in the upcoming year. Retracing the Dragon Trail in Iowa, environmental transformation along the Des Moines River, right?
Yeah, that'll be out in April on Michigan State University Press. Really excited about that project.
Perfect. And the other one is River of Growth. Stephen Watts Kearney, did I pronounce that correctly?
Kearney, like he was in the circus, but it's a thing people constantly go back and forth as. It's a whole debate. Anyway.
Okay, perfect. And the Missouri River expeditions of 1819 and 1824, right?
Yeah, he's also a dragoon. They're related projects, but that's coming out in edited volume that should be out sometime next year.
Perfect. Well, Kevin Stallings definitely don't stop at teaching as he actively contributes to his community by serving on the Board of Trustees for the State Historical Society in Iowa, while also running Notes on Iowa, a website Kevin founded to dive into extensive Iowa history. I also can't continue without mentioning the Notes on Iowa TikTok that has allowed people from anywhere and everywhere to have their eyes and ears on Iowa history, and they have never known about it.
Yeah, it's I think like creating in multiple formats is really important, and one of the directions the Academy should be looking, right, where the things that we do really well in history, particularly where you think about research standards and review standards that have been really rigorous and define the discipline, and how can we move into this modern era of storytelling. And Notes on Iowa has certainly been an experiment with that, which I think it's important to be looking at new technologies, to be thinking about them critically, and I'm sure that'll be a big part of our conversation today.
Yeah. Well, we're going to leave a link to your TikTok.
Sure.
Also, we're going to display it on the screen, but also on the description. But with that said, yeah, let's talk about technology a little bit. I'm really curious about your perspective as a historian about technology and specifically on AI, which is kind of has been my area where I've been growing for the past 2 years. So, Kevin, in your view, what is the impact of new technology on society from a historical perspective?
So I think technological history is one of my fields when I was working on my PhD at Iowa State. And so I'd like to think about technology critically. I think on one hand, we're always going to be resistant to technologies. You can see historical movements against technologies whenever they emerge. And I think that's been part of the discourse about AI in particular. As I've been really seeking in the past year, and I think especially with the help of CETL, since I've come here to UNI starting in the fall, if we're talking about AI specifically, it's something I don't necessarily, didn't really understand. And I think as somebody who tries to be really student-centered, the first time I really started thinking about AI critically, whether it was in the classroom or just in a broader sense, was I had a student come to my office, and he was just beside himself. He had been taking an exam, and he's a business major. He wasn't even a history person, and he's a phenomenal student that had taken one of my other classes, and he came in to just ask me kind of the same question about technology and history and whatever. But he had it framed around his own personal problem of that. They were using the screen locks and stuff, but one of the classmates in front of him had gotten around it in some way. And he says, how am I as a really good student supposed to compete with the entire brain power of the internet? And that was one of the first times it kind of crept into my world, right? And I think about like AI, there's all sorts of different things at stake, right? If we start to think about a lot of the pro cases, we'll talk about AI as a tool, right? Tools versus technologies, a lot of times have a lot of kind of different subcomponents, right? And we have to think about like with a tool, you retain agency, right? You are in control of it. I think there's all sorts of opportunities. One of the books I read this fall was a book by Danielle Russ, who's at MIT, and she wrote a book called The Mind's Mirror, which is risk and reward in the age of AI. And she's very much from this tool theory of use, right? But for something to be a tool, you have to retain agency and control. I think that's really easy for experts to see, and this is one of the arguments you see a lot, is like students shouldn't use it, but I should be able to as a professor. I don't necessarily, I think, buy that. Lock, stock, and barrel. I think it's kind of a cop-out sometimes to go like, well, because I already know how to use this stuff, I should be able to use this differently. We can get in the weeds about that a little bit either. One of the interesting things when we talk about tools versus technologies is external remaking of conditions related to choice, right? There are certain choices that if we're thinking and talking about LLMs particular as a tool, we're not necessarily making all of the choices that keep agency vested with us as users. So that's one of the things I've been thinking about with it, and I think is important whenever we talk about new technologies from a historical perspective. I also think one of the other things with this is when we talk about technologies coming into society, a lot of times, especially post Second Industrial Revolution, we're talking about automation versus human presence. And I think we've seen this be a back and forth push and pull in historical conversations for a really long time, right? We talk about we can automate our food system to a certain point, right? You can get a really efficient cheeseburger at McDonald's. Maybe you can get a better cheeseburger somewhere else where somebody really cares about the human presence in that process. And these aren't all things that are necessarily directly related or historical changes that are related to AI, but they're ways I like to think about any kind of new technology coming into society and things we need to be kind of considering as we think about this deeply and critically for student use, for our personal use, and for kind of, I think, the academy writ large. Because I think what we can't do when new technologies come into society is ignore them entirely. I think if we try to bury our head in the sand or have this very Luddite kind of approach to technologies where we're going to stay in the past, it's going to move past us and we're no longer going to be relevant to the world our students are being equipped to move into. And so I think we have to look at this from a variety of different angles and be willing to kind of see the complexities inherent in some of these technological changes.
You know, there is one thing that you mentioned about the human presence, and first of all, I'm going to steal that because I think that's a really good concept, human presence, right? And I think, as you were saying, that's something that we have been fighting for, after the Industrial Revolution, like this concept of, who's going to do this? Who's going to do that now? I don't know. I remember, like, I was born in the 80s, but, growing up in the 90s, I remember, like, newsreels talking all the time about, like, robots are going to come and they're going to essentially replace workers and all that stuff, right? Because that's when the technology kind of came up. And at the end, like, I see this trend where not necessarily robots replace everybody, but you kind of change certain aspects of society, or at least certain aspects in certain workplaces. So I think like it's really important to think about that human presence, that I feel that technologies maybe don't necessarily replace people, but makes you think about how you're going to do that job differently. Because that's one question I get asked all the time now with AI. Do you think AI is going to replace us? Do you think AI is going to replace humans? So also I want to ask you that, like, what is your thought about that? I have my own opinion, but like I'm more interested in yours.
At least in the kind of modern context, and I mean, I'm an American historian that studies really the 18 and 1900s. So I take it for what it is and my perspective on that. But I think anytime we've seen large scale disruptions from technological change, we've seen actually more jobs created than less. This is a point that was really driven home to me. There's a guy, I'll mispronounce his name, Joseph E. Aoun. He's the, I think, president at Northeastern. He wrote a book that was a focus of a CETL book club that I was in this fall with, organized by Gowrie and from Interior Design, and some of our other colleagues took part in that. It's called Robot Proof Higher Education, the Age of Artificial Intelligence. And he talked about this a lot, and he gave a lot of the data, I think, in a really meaningful way of how, when we see these technological changes, it actually tends to create more jobs than less. And it does require retooling. It requires thinking differently about how we're performing different functions. And I think that that's a real challenge for us in the academy. I think this is one of the things that specific fields, including and maybe especially my own, have really struggled with post-1970. I know I was just out giving a talk for a conference in Sioux Falls that's going to run on C-SPAN sometime early in the new year, and was talking about kind of how historians have avoided even the internet at this point in a meaningful way, where we talk about our discipline and we still execute the skills of our discipline in a way that like hasn't really changed since there was still a physical card catalog here in Rod Library. And unless we're willing to look at some of those things critically and adapt our skills, we're going to continue to lose, for lack of a better term, market share of doing history, right? This is where, like, and I obviously as a historian, I think about my own field more than others, but I think it can be representative for other folks, where you think about like the skills that we have as historians are still incredibly applicable. Actually, people needing to be able to differentiate between sources, to be able to, do that efficiently, be able to analyze effectively, and then communicate that in ways that reach different people are all as relevant as they've ever been. And history is also incredibly important within the American and global economy today. You think about it, it's one of the biggest parts of the publishing industry. It's one of the largest parts of the tourism industry. But because academic historians have been unwilling to embrace these new technologies, we've lost control of certain parts of our own discipline, where there's a lot of people doing history on TikTok, right? There's a lot of people writing historical books that find a wide audience. But a lot of the time, those aren't historians because they've refused. They go, we don't do that. We do peer-reviewed monographs that we read to each other. And unless we're willing to kind of embrace that, I think then you run the risk of becoming irrelevant, and you run the risk of not preparing your students for careers that are going to actually be useful to them as we move into the future. So I think part of that is like we have to look critically as an academy broader. If we extend that out, right, we're thinking about jobs going the other way. Like nobody feels bad for the ladies that used to, and they were predominantly ladies, they used to run the switchboard of the telephone company, right? I was putting together a switchboard museum last year, and I was thinking about this is so cool. You would sit here and you would plug the little things in. Nobody's like playing the sad world's smallest violin for those ladies, because you're reskilling and moving to the economy in different ways. And I think that we still have a need for people to connect telecommunications technologies together, connect different people. I think a lot of times it's being willing to look at what's coming and then work on those skills and think about what the important parts are of what we're doing. And then how can we continue to teach those people in a way that's going to play into the future? And that's where I think, like, as this conversation maybe moves towards technology in the classroom, that's how I really have started to think about it.
Yeah, and before we move into that, because that's also part of the conversation here, I'm really curious about to hear how your field specifically is using or not using. If it's not using AI, how might be using AI to further the field?
Yeah, I think even on my own, I mean, personally, I have an incredible reticence to start using AI for what I consider my real work. And this is one of the things, is like, I don't really understand AI, and if I don't understand something, one of my strategies is to learn as much about it as I can. And so part of that, one of the things I've really enjoyed since arriving here at UNI is I mean, you in particular and CETL as a whole. But then I think the university has a commitment to exploring this in a pretty meaningful way. And so whether that's going and learning more about prompting, which hasn't really helped me a ton there, I'm not willing to yield to AI like my grading and even thinking about course preparation, let alone what I look at as my actual research, where a lot of times AI is like a lot of the documents I'm using as a historian are in archives and non-digitized. AI doesn't have a ton of application for that. And I could use it in back-end ways to reorganize my writing or to do some of those things. I'm just not comfortable with that at this point and not willing to do it. And I think that there's also, as these things haven't been defined ethically within fields, right? I think it creates an incredible challenge, right? Even just the chatter, whether it's across the different social media platforms, in professional communities, I think, or even just, at the octopus on the hill between colleagues, right? I don't think there's any kind of broad ranging consensus. And I've worked very hard to build my career, right? I'm a community college person who really scrapped my way to a PhD. And I'm not willing to really risk that at this point for a technology that the field seems very reticent to go like, I think if I was like, well, I'm using this to create my bibliographies, or I'm bringing in my sources and I'm doing this, I think that there's the potential that the field could swing very hard against you in a meaningful way. And that's where it's like, I think there needs to be caution. And I think that there needs to be a willingness to look at it critically, to have the conversations. And I think that's really where, at least history as a field, I don't even know, we're starting to have some of them. You see them popping it up at conferences, you're seeing it pop into the discourse online, and people talking about it in different ways, if only lamenting their students using it. And I think that we need to be having these conversations. And until we start to kind of figure some of the details out, I'm not going to really roll it into my professional work in that way. Now, in the stuff I've been doing with Notes on Iowa, I've kind of played with it in some different ways, where especially as it relates to like prompting and image creation, I've done some of that stuff and like thrown it out there as a fun internet garbage thing, right? I'm unwilling to yield the writing, although one of the things that I've been playing with on Notes on Iowa, because it gives me a chance to write every day, is using some of the structures that LLMs use to see how they get kind of prioritized within the algorithms on social media, which is a whole different thing, right? But then, like, I don't like how it sounds. Like, I spent a few months where I was creating new posts and I was intentionally trying to write similarly to what's coming out of the LLMs, like with the serial lists and using additionally and however, and just some of the markers that you can really see, particularly coming out of ChatGPT. And I didn't like how it made my writing sound. And I didn't see a huge traffic bump on those posts. And that could also be the content, right? It's hard to sift out some of that stuff against the algorithm. But I definitely got some pushback from people that read it and they went like, I can't believe you're using AI for this. And I'm like, I'm not, but I'll take it as a compliment because that's what I was trying to do. I don't know. I think anytime you see these new technologies, I think you have to explore them thoroughly. And I think also I've been pretty cautious in taking steps forward. And I think like knowing how to do something and understanding the technology has to come before using it. And this is as important, I think, to professionals as it is to, I think, people should be more critical of how they're using these technologies in their day-to-day life. And then also, especially for our students who I think are less likely to think about it critically, especially when they're under pressure for good grades and they have to look around and see like, well, some of my peers are going to use this. Or I think I can outsmart my professor this way, which I'm sure in some cases they can and have. But I think like, if we're as the adults in the room not willing to have these critical conversations, or we're not thinking about our own use in a meaningful way, how can we expect our students to have those conversations? And how can we expect ourselves to have meaningful conversations with them about it if we're not thinking about it first and developing those skills in a way that at least lead us to basic understanding?
Yeah. Have you been using AI in your classroom with your students? Like, what is your level of comfort?
So
doing that?
it's been an interesting kind of pathway with it, where I started out, and part of this was my previous institution. I think had a very different approach to AI, and different doesn't mean better or worse. I don't think it was just from an administrative perspective. It was we're going to try to prevent students from using this. Part of that is they have a very large online presence, and I think like if we get into a world where students are submitting AI work that's being graded by AI on the professor end, and it's just the feedback's being tailored slightly that nobody reads, what a danger for higher ed going forward. And I was seeing it and it started to creep into my room, into my classroom in pretty major ways. They invested in all of the technologies, right? Within Blackboard, we don't have this at UNI, but they started using the CopyLeak scanning tool, which has its own problems, but it is one of those things where if you see that this is obviously ChatGPT, it gives you at least some kind of data point to be able to go and it's 100% in the copy scanning tool. I think it's always a mistake to lean too hard into using AI to check for AI, to what are the ethics of that, or even just the utility, I don't know. I started to move and think in my classroom a little bit differently about technology around the time of the pandemic, certainly coming back from that. Part of that was maybe I was newly tenured and I was in a position to experiment a little bit more. I started to think about, okay, well, what's the main thing? And when I was a long time college basketball coach, athletic director, he talks about make the main thing, right? Or keep it simple, stupid, all these kind of coaching euphemisms. But, well, what do I want my students to do? I want them to research things with a quality of depth. I want them to understand the differences between sources and authors and the content they're bringing in. I want them to be able to take those sources and develop their own analytical takes on things and then communicate that efficiently. And so with that, you start if you're assigning traditional essays, I was really starting to see a huge AI creep, right? And so one of the things that I think that we as educators should do is be thinking about, well, how can I assignment design and curriculum design more effectively to remove this? And so part of that's you and I, people love tilting assignments. That's one way to do it. Thinking about breaking it into parts, thinking about really having clear conversations with your students about here's why I want you to do this, and here's what you're supposed to be learning in this class, and here's how you will undercut that if you're using AI. And if all of a sudden it's I always think about it I really like to work out. That's a big part of my life. And I think about if all of a sudden I just had ChatGPT working out for me, I'd probably never see any gains in the gym, right? Which is a really corny, maybe gym bro way to think about it. But I do think about if our students are not getting these basic kind of developments and they're not practicing the skills that meet the learning outcomes that are assigned to the classes, well, then they're really not getting anything out of their time here other than socialization, and hopefully they maybe they go to a few football games and take part in traditions. And we need to be in a position where in the classroom we're thinking critically about our classes, and a big part of that is going to take a lot of work, right? If we go back to human presence, which we were talking about earlier, if you're running your classes the same way you were before AI or before the internet, you're no longer running a course that's relevant, because students will be able to just get through that with that. I mean, maybe they won't want to, right? That's one of the other things is I've had more and more open conversations with my students about AI and developed a policy that's more inclusive. So part of it is I'm having conversations out of the gate about AI in my classes. I have a policy that lines up well with the workshops that Cietl's been running on this, and I'll plug them here. I'm sure we will have more in the future that you can come talk with Wilson about designing a good policy. If you have questions about that, I'm happy to talk to you about it as well. I think if you can put together a good policy and then you can communicate that clearly with your students, here's why I don't want you to use this for this. One of the things that I saw this semester by doing that is my students had much more open conversations with me about AI. Now, I had a few that still used it, right? I've always had students that cheated in my classes. They used to copy and paste Wikipedia into their papers and then turn it in and would catch them, right? And I've had students in the past that I know have been running contract cheating businesses, and I can prove it. It's one of the things that I'm not Scooby-Doo, so I wasn't able to suss it out, but I did try to figure it out. People have been cheating as long as there's been college, right? And I hate to even bring that perspective, because I don't mean it and we should just let it happen. But I think you can move away from that by having open conversations and explaining with students. And then when you have the students that are still going to do it anyway, to then confront them about it and go reiterate your point. And then if it becomes a real problem where it's well, sorry, I'm going to try to outsmart you still, then you got to decide have a consistent policy, have those things. What I saw this semester by having a more clear policy and having more clear conversations was I saw fewer students using it on their written work week to week. Part of that's my assignment design has them do this work outside of class, and they come into class and talk about it with each other, and they contribute in really meaningful ways, and they get graded on that, which takes a lot more grading on my part to do that week to week. It's a huge time investment, but I can tell you, I could go through my roster of my survey class right now that has 38 students in it, and I could tell you which ones grew and in what ways, and that's my job, right?
Yeah, no, and I agree with you in basically everything that you said. I teach online, which it's another dimension when you put AI at play as well. And I have a policy, I run the sessions, but I try to do what I preach, right? I have my policy, and I had that, not necessarily conversation, but I had that, I put a video and say, look, this is why you're going to use AI in this way, in this particular context, in this class. But the goal of this class at the end of the day is for you to develop these skills. That's why you are here. So when you have those conversations with the students, they understand. And to be honest, maybe they outsmart me this semester, but I didn't have any issues with having students using AI. But again, because I had that conversation, it was clear they know what is expected, right? And also, I think it's really important to explain, in my perspective, the why. Why you shouldn't be using AI for this, and when it's okay to use it. Because at the end of the day, as you said, you are the adult in the room, right? At the end of the day, you know where it's coming. You understand where they are coming and where they are going in terms of, maybe the curriculum mapping, right? You understand what skills they need to go to the next class. So I think that's also important to really have a conversation with the students in terms of, this is why you shouldn't not use AI. Right.
And I think if you can build that trust, right? This was one of the most rewarding things, I think, for the entire semester for me, period, was I put together a good policy. I think I got it clearly. I had a few submissions over the course of the semester in the same way. I think you'll always see people pushing bounds to see where the lines are. And I think that's human nature. And I saw a lot of students correct, or a lot, it was 2 students that when I went hey, I think you're using this in a way that we talked about, we shouldn't be using it. I saw them they somehow outsmarted me beyond that and devoted more work to figuring out how to get around it, but saw them correct. And then when we got to our final project, where I asked them to take anything from the course, as a broad course on U.S. history, to the American Civil War, right? We're covering a lot of stuff really fast, and I want to give students an opportunity to dive deeper into specific topics, and then also to either develop new skills or push themselves to do something they enjoy at a time of the semester here at the end that isn't always the most enjoyable, right? So they put together their sources and they did that. And then they were working on these creative objects. And one of the things that started to come out of these conversations was, as we were talking about it in class, students started asking me where they could use AI in the projects with very specific examples. Hey, I'm writing a song and I know I did my sources, I'm working on the lyrics for it, but I'm not necessarily that musical. Can I use AI to make the musical part? Or can I use it I'm making a newspaper that's set in the 1850s, and this was a student who is a female student. She went, I know that I wouldn't be able to publish a newspaper in the 1850s. And I was like, well, Amelia Jenks Bloomer was doing that. But anyway, and she said, like, I want to create an AI image of myself as a man to put on the editor masthead as like this thing. And I went like, I don't see how that that does nothing against the standards for the class. I think that's totally useful, and I think it'll make it more interesting as you do it. Or I had another student that coded an entire world of women's rights across early American history, and she used AI for some of those pieces, and that's fine with me because this isn't a coding class. And what I care about is the research and how you're communicating it. And I think if you can pull in these other skills you have or you're developing and use them in a meaningful way that goes across the curriculum and maybe develops a different skill set, awesome. And I think it's not that they were making cool stuff. People have always made cool stuff in those classes. It was that they were willing to be transparent in those conversations. And instead of just doing it, not only did they come and ask me first, they felt like they could ask me and that I would understand where they were getting at. And I think if I would have told them no, they just wouldn't have done it. And I think like that's when we talk about this presence in our classes, we need to be thinking about our presence in those classes as much as the students. And how can we be there for our students? How can we have these conversations in a way that builds trust? And then how do we get them to understand what you're supposed to get out of this class and where they can develop other things?
Yeah, no, and I think you are hitting in a great point because the research is telling us right now that students are looking for guidance. They want to be guided on how to use this technology, and I think your approach is really hitting on those points. I really would like to ask you this. You know, what are things that surprised you about this technology in general?
Yeah. I mean, just the speed with which it can do all sorts of different things, right? Like, I think when we were in the video prompting kind of session you were running a few weeks ago, like how it can empower imagination to do different things. And it takes the human input of that imagination, right? That's a tool argument that you're going through, and then you have to realize like, okay, well, I took a photo from the UNI archives. Sorry, Tessa. And I fed it into the thing, and I prompted it to take this football picture from the 1890s at UNI. And then they broke the picture, and they went and ran a play afterwards. And like, I had to have a very clearly delineated prompt to get that to move in that way. And then I had to adjust the prompt afterwards so that somebody actually hiked the football instead of it just starting to move, and like subtract an arm here, and like those kinds of things are incredible to me. I think there's also other applications where this can be an incredibly powerful tool if you learn how to yield it. So I was recently working on a project, which I guess this would go into the field. I was working on a forthcoming article for the Middle West Review. And the editor of that publication had tasked me with going back through the Journal of American History to 1964 and compiling all the articles into a spreadsheet and running data analysis on it. And there were ways to do that where, first, I could sit down and I could hammer all those articles into a spreadsheet, and it would take me months. And I would be willing to do that. I tried to get the LLMs to do it without success, and ended up creating a Python script that worked to do it and scrape that data and put them together. And I still had to go back and check it and make sure it wasn't hallucinating articles into it. And then I'm running the data analysis myself. That's incredible to me, and what would have taken me months of work to just put those together. Now, Python isn't necessarily, this isn't artificial intelligence, but it is running a program that can do this for me. And that's how I think if we're using AI in the right ways, it's functioning more like those other kinds of technologies, right? And that's where, like, that's fascinating to me. I think that there are so many different applications, and we're just going to scratch the surface of what these technologies can do. They're getting better as they're trained on things all the time, and there's ethics involved in that are certainly unsettled and dark in some places. But also, I think like there's all sorts of things that I think there can be to be excited about these technologies, and you're using them every day, whether you realize it or not. that's one of the other things I think is important for people to recognize and understand. Because I think like sometimes people act like they're anti-AI and that they're never going to use that technology, and they're already using it without their consent hundreds of ways every single day if you're using the internet or anything else.
Yeah, like for example, like I always give this example of Google Maps. Google Maps it's an AI system that aggregates your cell phone position to, for example, provide you with the best route with available data.
And that's
and we use it every day, right? And I don't know. I think like you're right on that regard. Like we should be, I feel, skeptical on certain aspects of the technology, but also we shouldn't be blind to say like I'm not gonna use it. Like you are already using it, like so.
And that's where I think like when these technologies become at a certain level, right? When they start to, like, if we go back to our industrial, like electricity, right? You can refuse to use the internal combustion engine or electricity. Your life is looking incredibly different if you're going to participate in modern society. And I don't know if that's what AI will become. It seems to me, and this is just my personal take on it, is it does seem to be moving in that direction where it is underpinning so many things we never think about using, where it's like, whether it's the algorithms in social media or how you're being fed ads across different platforms, including Google, or Google Maps is a great example of these technologies that are, AI is embedded in those in so many incredible ways that as a regular like back-end user, you're probably not ever going to think about. Now, there's something I think different between that and intentional use for different purposes, right? Where like with our students using this in different ways, or even how like there's a pathway where people are going to use this in nefarious ways that are terrible. Does that mean like people also like, I hate to make like hyperbolic statements, right? Where like people also use all sorts of technologies in terrible ways. That doesn't mean we shouldn't necessarily have those technologies. And this is where, again, I continue to go back to, I don't have the answers to this stuff. I think it'd be insane for me to say that I understand how all this is working and what all the positives and negatives are. But I also think it's important that all of us start to explore these technologies, even if that's just reading about it. Right? Even if that's just trying to understand a little bit in depth and going through and looking at the arguments, not just for and against, but in all these complexities in between, where as we kind of like move through this conversation, I think there's some really easy stuff I'd like to recommend to people. Like I recommended a couple of books earlier, one being that Robot Proof book, which has a lot of interesting stuff, I think, for educators about experiential learning. There's interesting that book by Daniela Rust from MIT about the mind's mirror, which is it's supposed to be risk and reward in the age of AI. It's an overwhelmingly positive book about AI from a computer scientist. Like, just know that if you're going to read that book. There's also a couple of things. One of our colleagues, David, in the English department, passed along recently about a very hyperbolic title, AI is Destroying the University and Learning Itself, out of Current Affairs by a professor named Ronald Purser at San Francisco State. It certainly raises all sorts of interesting points in there that I think are food for thought as people think about this in a complex way. There's also another great piece that I read recently by Patrick Lin out of the Cal Poly San Luis Obispo. And he actually wrote it as a thing to hand to students to have these kind of conversations we're talking about. It's called Why We're Not Using AI in This Course, Despite Its Obvious Benefits. And he lays out in a very nuanced case for here's where AI is a skill worth developing or maybe not developing. And then also, here's why we're not going to use it in this class. And he said he wrote the thing that he wanted to see, right? That he had been looking for something to hand to his students to get them to think critically about this. And I can say it's a really powerful piece that, like, I always think good reading material or good things you're reading, like, pop into your head randomly when you're I don't know, walking the dog or driving
Yes.
or whatever. And for the few weeks since I read that, it's popped into different points have popped in my head a bunch of different times that I think are really nuanced points that are worth considering. And so that's one of the things that I want to encourage, whether it's colleagues or just people broadly. I don't know who watches this podcast, but it's like, don't just ignore that this is happening, because your students are using it. Your students are thinking about it. And if you can't have anything more nuanced than, no, I disagree with this as a thing, and you can't explain to them why, you're not doing them any service. And I actually think you're doing yourself a disservice by not thinking about it deeply. And that's what we're supposed to be really good at here in the university, right?
Yeah. And to be honest, like, again, students are looking at us for guidance, right? We are the ones, like, and I'm talking about teachers, like educators. We are the ones who are interacting with students every day, and they're looking for our guidance in different topics, right? One of them being AI, right? So I think it's really important to have those conversations. Now, I want to ask you a question here, related to what you were talking about. How do we ensure students are thinking critically about AI rather than just using it? And I know, like, we don't have all the answers, but, what is your take on that?
I think transparency is really important, right? Where you have to have the conversations, you have to design good policies. I think we also, as a university, need to have a broader conversation around policy as it relates to AI. And I think this is like umbrella of mercy here, because I'm both new, and my general sense has been you and I, from an administrative standpoint, seems to be at least more pro exploring AI than some other places. And I think that, like, if we're going through and thinking about how do we open those conversations, part of it's having conversations, part of it's exploring the technologies and understanding them ourselves. And then also, I think it's creating the space to do that. You can only have that space, and you can only have genuine, trusting relationships, though, if you're building those relationships first, right? And that's what a lot of our students are looking for. And I'm not here to say you are here to be, I think this is an entirely different conversation about the role of the professor, right? And I had somebody once tell me, like, our job is to be the first academic mentor. Now, like, I tend to, I think, build more personal relationships with students than some, but I think that that's an important thing to keep in mind, and that this is a professional skill that people are developing as well. As I've talked to my students that have moved out into the field, some of them are, like, using this in ways that I would encourage them not to. Some of them are using it in all sorts of powerful ways that I would have never thought to use it. And I think that if we're kind of muting ourselves in that conversation, or we're being, if we're creating an environment where students don't feel comfortable talking about this thing that they're exploring anyway, that is a professional skill or is going to be a professional skill, we're not servicing our students in the way that we should be. And that's just, like, there's a lot of room, I think, for nuance and disagreement there, but that's kind of how I'm seeing it at this point in time.
I cannot beat what you just said, because I think it's beautiful.
Thanks.
I think it really speaks to one of the things that, again, as educators, we should be doing, which is create relationships with our students and create environments where they feel that they can explore, right? And I think, like, that's important beyond the technical skills, right? I think, like, that, going back to that human presence, I think that's what our students are looking for, this kind of more human presence in our classrooms, and build trust. And when you create those environments, I feel, as you said, you are able to have those conversations and guide the students to use these kind of technologies critically. Before we part ways today in our podcast here. What is one advice you can provide to your colleagues about AI in education?
So colleagues at multiple levels, right? So I think about with faculty, I think it's important that we try to understand this technology in a meaningful way, even if that's at a very basic level. I think like we have to have a constant commitment if we are going to be the teaching college of Iowa and we're going to be leaders in higher education in the state, which I think we intend to do, to understanding these trends in higher education, whether you think this is a momentary fad or you think it's something that's going to reshape all of human civilization, or hopefully somewhere in between. I think it's important to understand that. I think from an administrative perspective, which I know I'm not their colleague, I think it's also important to create the space and understand that optimization of everything is not what higher education is, right? We need to create the space for general intellectual struggle. And if that's too expensive for higher education, we're no longer fulfilling our function within society, right? This is where I think sometimes we start to optimize everything. We can lose the most important parts of our mission, things like critical thinking, imagination, working on skills that have traditionally defined higher education. If we're not creating the space for those things, we are going to move ourselves out of this business quickly, because you can optimize learning in all sorts of different ways. If you are moving towards knowledge refashioned as just a transactional commodity, we're going to have a hard time competing in that marketplace. And I think that if that comes with other things I think are problematic, like treating students solely as consumers, right? We're here to build relationships. We are here to give students the space to try and fail and try again better. And I think we're here to equip them with these new skills. And I think that we have to be looking at all of those things, and in a very complex moment in higher education. And these are things that, again, I don't have the answers to, but I think they should be a part of these conversations as we're going through them. And I think that at the most basic level, what I want to say to my colleagues is, let's keep the conversation going, and commit to understanding this in a way that serves our students and puts their needs as humans and as people that are going to have to enter a workforce that this is a part of at the forefront of what we're doing.
Well, Kevin, thank you so much for having this time with us today. Thank you so much.
Appreciate you having me. Thanks, Wilson.